Well, I'm delighted today to be able to welcome Stephen Cottrell, Archbishop of York, to join me for my final conversation on the last chapter of Living His Story. So welcome very much, Stephen. Thank you for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Hannah. Great to be with you.
And actually, when I was thinking about who was I going to get to look at the various chapters, I instantly knew that I wanted to discuss this final chapter with you, and this idea of faith as a journey, and sometimes the long and complicated journey towards faith, particularly in our postmodern culture. Because I know I've heard you speak on that subject at St. Mellitus when you've come and lectured us, and I know it's something that you've thought about. So I'm really looking forward to your insights on that subject today. I wonder whether I could just begin by asking you about your own journey to faith, and whether there was a dramatic experience of faith for you, or whether it was more of a long sort of process.
Yeah, well, and Hannah, you're probably going to have to shut me up in a moment, because although I've given my testimony hundreds of times, and it's not a short one, because in a way, when I tell the story, it is I hope to illustrate the point that actually for most people, becoming a Christian is much more like a journey than it is like an event. And I notice in the book that you compare the Emmaus Road experience to the Damascus Road experience, but the Damascus Road experience often is the controlling experience. People kind of think that's the gold standard of becoming a Christian, but for many of us, it's not like that, and that was the case for me. So I wasn't brought up in a church family. I was baptized as a baby, so I did make at least one visit to church in my childhood. But the short version of the rather long story for me, I think starts first of all with the thinking I think I always believed in God. And I kind of always want to hang on to that I think so many people, especially children, have a really strong sense of God. I don't know where it came from particularly. I just remember believing in God and having some dreams about God as a child. And so that was always deep inside me, the sense that there is a God, but unformed. Then my sister joined the Girl Guides. Well, she's my younger sister, so she'd have been about 10 or 11 at the time. I'd have been 12 or 13, I suppose. She joined the Girl Guides, and she was required to go to a church parade service once a month. She and a small group of friends liked what they found at the church parade service, and so started going along on the other Sundays in between and got confirmed. My parents were part of the great post-war lapsed generation who hadn't rejected the Christian faith, they'd just gotten out the habit. They returned to church through my sister, and eventually I gave church a try. Another contributing factor at this point was a girl I rather fancied in the youth club at the church, and you weren't allowed to go to the youth club on a Sunday evening if you hadn't been to church in the morning. So that was a motivation. And somehow these things wove together. There was also an RE teacher at school who had a profound impact on me, not that I ever told her. But she was obviously a Christian. When she taught us about the Christian faith, it was obvious she believed in it, it mattered, and that had an impact. And I think because it is a long story, I think all I could, the bit of scripture that really means a lot to me is, that bit at the end of John chapter 6, where Jesus has fed the 5,000. They've all come back the next day for another free lunch. I mean, who wouldn't? But on that day, Jesus doesn't give them lunch. He says, "I'm the bread," and they don't like that, so they all go. And then right at the end of John chapter 6, Jesus says to the disciples, "Well, I suppose you're going to go as well." And Peter says, "Where else can we go? You have the words of eternal life." And in the end, that's where I found myself standing, that I'd sort of been drawn into the orbit of the church. I had this sort of unformed belief in God. I didn't like church particularly, but I started to make some friends there. I just found myself kind of looking back, thinking, where else can I go? This is it. My life has been completely mucked up. This was not the life I'd had planned, but here I am, a follower of Jesus Christ. So over the course of, several years, I got drawn into I got caught in the snare of the living God. Let me put it that way.
Brilliant. Thank you. And yeah, as you sort of recognize there, this idea of the journey is much more normal for people. But I wonder how you think that should therefore impact the way we engage in evangelism? Because often we assume it has to be this instant moment, that there's going to be this decisive point, and sometimes there are lots of stories, aren't there, even in scripture, where that is the case. But I wonder what your thoughts are on, you know, if your experience is true for lots of other people's journey to faith, how that should impact the way we engage in evangelism.
Well, I mean, as your book helpfully explains, you know, actually the majority of people have an experience much more like a journey than like an event, though there are key moments on the way. And you also, I think, very powerfully make the point that there's still a place, you know, for preaching about the Christian faith, because that will be a key point on somebody's journey when somebody explains and commends the Christian faith. And speaking as, you know, I absolutely believe in the power of the spoken word and in preaching, and consider myself to be, you know, God has called me to be an evangelist. So I think I have that ministry where I want to tell people about the Christian faith. But the difference nowadays, I suppose, is that when I speak about the Christian faith, of course, I hope people respond there and then to the call of the gospel. But I don't feel I've failed if they don't, because I realize that what I'm doing will be a step on the journey for people. The other thing that, as I've often reflected on my own story, I realized that how God has woven into my story the witness of so many other people who all played their part. You know, so I've often found myself, as I've got older and told the story more and reflected on it, I've often thought about those Girl Guide leaders. You know, what they must have had, you know, they must have been people of profound lived faith, that somehow they persuaded that little group of girls that the Christian faith mattered. And through them, and then through the silent witness of my sister, I don't remember my sister ever saying anything to me about her newfound faith, but her silent witness had an impact on me. And then I think of, you know, the people who ran the youth group. Actually, it was the curate who ran the youth group at the church. And all those people played a different part in my story. Now, those people probably, I bet if you spoke to that Girl Guide leader, she wouldn't call herself an evangelist, but she was a witness to Jesus. And of course, all of us can do that. So my other reflection here is that just as God has woven people into my story, so he can weave me and you and everyone into other people's stories. And so I think to myself, God is the evangelist. You know, which is a relief, really. Means we don't, you know, it's not our job. That's God's job. God converts people. Our job is to witness to that according to our different gifts, circumstances, and we can all do different things. And sometimes it's those unseen ministries of service and witness in the local church, again, which I know you write about a lot in your book. It's those things which, when we look back, we say, oh, didn't our hearts burn within us when those people said those things and did those things? Though at that moment, I didn't realize it was Christ.
Well, that's really helpful. And I think that kind of helps take some of the pressure we can put on ourselves in evangelism. If we realize sometimes we are just one link in a chain. Yeah, it's great if we get to be the person who sees them actually come to faith and say yes to Jesus. But sometimes it's, you know, it's earlier on in the journey, and we don't always get to see the fruit of, you know, what God's doing. But I wonder whether perhaps you could reflect a little on how, as a church, we might kind of what are some of the things we might do to help people along the journey to faith? I mean, is it all just down to our sort of individual conversations, or are there things as a church in terms of how we structure our, you know, evangelistic activity that kind of might help people along the journey?
Yeah, well, I think there's 3, possibly 4 things that immediately spring to mind. First of all, and I think it's where your book really helps, is we just need to carry on teaching people that evangelism is what God does, and he asks us to help. And we can help in different ways. And all of that working together helps accompany people on the journey. So I think some teaching about this is what evangelism really is. That it's not that scary thing that only some people can do and I really could have no part in. It's what God does, and we can all play a part. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I think being a church which is really serving its local community and being a blessing. I think that the best way of showing what the Christian faith is all about is by showing it in action, in service, in our local communities. And people often don't think of that as evangelism, but it's part of building that culture of witness. And of course, God opens all sorts of doors through that. Then thirdly, is what I call a place of nurture. Somewhere where people who are not yet Christians can come and find out a bit more about the Christian faith. And again, you mentioned this in your book. The most famous examples of this are things like the Alpha Course is the most famous, but Pilgrim, Christianity Explored, Emmaus, things like this. It's not right for everybody, but it's amazing how many people it is right for. And it gives you a chance to ask your questions, to meet other people. And it can be a place where the journey can take place. Now, those things, simply understanding what evangelism is about, having that culture of witness and service in your local community, building a place of nurture where people can find out who are not yet part of the Christian community. I think those three things make a huge difference. If I added a fourth, it will be a little challenge to those of us who are called to be evangelists and to the preachers and teachers of the Christian faith. Sometimes I think, I'm speaking tentatively because I don't want to sound like I'm being judgmental of others. I'm speaking to myself as well. I think sometimes we set the bar too low. We're anxious to be seen to be, friendly, welcoming, hospitable church, and obviously we must be. But we don't, there's not enough challenge. And I think particularly with young people, what they want is the challenge. I remember when I was a young person, as a teenager, beginning to think about following Christ. I wanted to let us go and die with him. It was a life of sacrifice and adventure. And I still believe that. That's what it's about. And I think sometimes we sell people short. So I think we need to be challenging people for a big response, that the Christian faith is good. It's good for you, it's good for the world, and it can change the world. And please join us in this great work of, not filling up the church, changing the world.
Yeah, so looking at discipleship then as more than just come and say yes to this Jesus. It's actually, come and enter into this story, come and be part of God's adventure.
We've turned it into this kind of private, have your private thing with Jesus, rather than join with Jesus in his great purpose of transforming the world.
Yeah. I'd love to ask you one final question. Just think about anyone who maybe is watching this recording and perhaps feeling, discouraged about evangelism. Maybe there's a friend or a family member. It's sometimes hard with family members, isn't it? Where you've been maybe praying for them for years and years, and you just aren't seeing any change. How do you approach that? What's your encouragement in that kind of situation?
Yeah. Oh, Hannah, what a question. And I don't know whether I've got any wisdom to help, because of course that's my story as well. We've all got people we love who either have abandoned the Christian faith or just slipped out of the way or have not responded, or for whom it just doesn't seem to make any sense. And that can be very painful when it's people we love and we've prayed that they might know Christ. And, when I do meet God face to face, I think it's something I really want to, say to him, Lord, why is that? Why is it that, that it's so clear to one person and so very unclear to another? Why is that? I don't understand that. I think all I would say is perseverance in prayer is the most important thing. The one bit of my story I haven't told you about is my Auntie Millie. Now, my Auntie Millie was a devout Roman Catholic, went to Mass every day of her life. When I was ordained as a deacon, she came to my ordination service. I think she probably got a special dispensation from the Pope to attend, because these were the days when, it wasn't at all normal for Catholics to attend an Anglican church. Anyway, she came. She was really pleased for me. She bought me a present, a book of Cardinal Hume's sermons. And at the bum fight after the ordination, she told me that every day of her life, when she'd been to Mass, she had prayed for the conversion of my family, because none of us were church people. And when she told me that somebody had been praying for me every day of my life, I suddenly saw my whole story in a new way and thought, I thought I'd become a Christian because of decisions I'd made. I had decided to do this and I decided to follow that. And yet here was another person that had been woven into my story who I never knew. She simply prayed for me and for my family. So I know the power of perseverance in prayer. But again, if you're somebody who's been praying like I have for members of my family with no obvious fruitfulness, you'll probably think, yeah, well, that's all very well for you, but what about me? What about my son, my husband, my parents? So persevere in prayer. But the other thing I think to remember is, perhaps I'll end where I kind of started, God is the evangelist. Trust God, trust God's good timing. And I think also know that God's love for me is not any greater because I have responded to Christ. And if I, God forbid, but if I did choose to reject the Christian faith, the one thing I cannot do is stop God loving me. And so I think I want people to know that even if their loved ones do not respond to Christ, that does not mean that God has not stopped loving them and does not walk alongside them, still unrecognized, as Jesus walked with Cleopas and his companion on the Emmaus Road.
Thank you so much. A beautiful note to end on, a reminder of God as the evangelist. Thank you so much for your time today, Stephen. May God continue to bless you in your ministry and in your evangelistic.
Yeah, thank you. And Hannah, thank you for a great book, which I think is really going to be a blessing for the church.
Thank you so much. Thank you.